this video, I'm going to show you how to set up your Visual Studio so that you can program with ASP.NET Core and also SQL Server. So on the screen just now you can see I've got Visual Studio Installer open. The reason why I've got it open just now is because the way I've got my machine set up means I need to log in as an admin in order to be able to access this. So just to show you how to get here, so you can click on your Start button and it's just Visual Studio Installer and you can see it's just here. So that's what I've clicked and this is what we get open. Now on here you can see I've got one version of Visual Studio installed just now. That version is Visual Studio Community 2019, which as you can see on the description here, it says free for students and also for open source contributors and individuals. Now if I click on modifying here, what this is going to do once it's got things ready for me is it's going to show me everything that I've got selected in terms of what I can use on my machine and what I can develop with in Visual Studio. So at the top here, this is the most important one for today. So I've got ASP.NET and web development selected, and you can see this allows me to build web applications using ASP.NET Core, which is what we want. Now if I just scroll this down, you can also see that I've got data storage and processing enabled, and this will allow us by the end of today's tutorial to be able to connect to a database using SQL Server. There are other things I have selected here, that's because I do use this for other development projects, so please ignore these. The two that we need are ASP.NET and web development, and also our data storage and processing here. Okay, so once I've got everything installed that I need to, I'm going to go ahead and open Visual Studio 2019. Okay, and once it's open, you'll see something like this, and it will have, if you've had any recent projects, the recent project listed on this left hand side just here. Now what we're going to do is create a new project. We're going to make sure that we have C# selected. We're then going to select ASP.NET Core Web Application just here and click the next button. I'm going to give this application a name. Now I'm going to call it Store because I'm going to create a shop application. I'm going to leave the location where it's going to save to just where it's as default, but you can change this if you want to. Solution name, I'm going to leave this as store as well. I'm going to show you why this is important later on. I'm going to click create. Okay, now once I've got through to this additional configuration screen here, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a web application using models, views and controllers. Now the reason we're using this is because it allows us to separate our concerns. So what that means to us is that we're going to be able to separate our logic in our controller, our database and any data that we're dealing with into our model, and what the customer or the viewer or website viewer sees on the screen into a view using the MVC. Now there are a few other options we're going to make sure that we haven't got here. The first is that authentication is going to be turned off because we're going to write this authentication system, and we're also going to make sure that at the moment we have configure for HTTPS turned off, and then going to click create. Okay, so this is now creating my project. Now once your project is ready, you'll have something which looks like this. Now we're going to start on the right hand side here, and we're going to have a quick look or an overview of what the project or the solution for the project looks like. So we can see here we have the name of application, which I've just called store just now, and we can see a couple of important folders here. So we've got models, views and controllers. So we are going to use these throughout today's tutorial. And another concern, another thing that we need to be aware of is the www root. So if I look into there, you can see I've got a CSS directory, a JS directory, amongst others, but these should be recognisable to us. The first thing we're going to do now that we've got our project set up is we're going to have a look inside the controllers directory, and you can see by default we have what's called the home controller, and this is also our default controller. So in terms of starting this app now, we're viewing it in our browser. All I need to do is click this play button at the top, which says IIS Express. And if I bear with it, the machine will start up an IIS server in the background, or a portable server in the background, and it will run our application direct from our code base. Okay, so we can see now that our app is actually running now. So this is just the result of me clicking the play button from the top of Visual Studio 2019. And this is what it gives me on the screen. So what this has done is it's built a standard app. Now in the background, what you'll notice if you've used Bootstrap before is this is actually based on Bootstrap. So I can have a look at the code for this by inspecting, and we'll see that we have some pretty standard HTML in here, which is based around Bootstrap. So for example, we have our navbar here. We also have a container, and inside there our navbar brand, etc. Okay, so this is our standard app. So what we're going to do just to close this is close off the browser. Okay, and what you'll notice is the play button becomes available again. It's actually stopped the server for us in the background. Okay, so the next step for us is now to create our own controller. So we're going to right click on controllers. We're going to go down to add, and then we're going to click add controller. Okay, and what it'll ask us to do is choose what type of controller we want to add. Now in this case, what we're going to do is select an MVC controller which is empty, and then click add. Once we've clicked add, it's going to prompt us for a name. Now we're going to create what's a controller that's going to allow us to log into the system. So we're going to deal with our authentication system first off. So we're going to call it authentication controller, which keeps things nice and clear for us. I'm going to click add. So once Visual Studio's done its thing, we'll end up with a blank controller on the screen. Now you can see on line 7 here we have what's called a namespace, and remember I said when we create this app at the start that our name would become important as we start to look through the code. So you can see here that my application is called store. Again, that matches the application name on the right hand side here. And then we're inside the controllers directory, which is all the namespace is. We're inside the store app, inside the controllers directory. Inside here we've then got a class created, so it's a public class. It's called authentication controller, which is what we named it, and this also matches the file name. And then we're using a base class just called controller, which is ASP.NET Core's standard base controller here. Now inside this controller we've got a standard function or method called index. Now what that means is that when we visit authentication, so this part here in our web address, which I'll show you in a second, then it's going to jump straight to this method. So for me to add additional methods in here, what I would need to do is just type in an additional public. I'm going to give it a method name, so I'm going to give it a result first of all. That's what we're going to do when we ask to call it in the browser. I'm going to call it login, and then I'm going to return a view. Okay, you can see everything's cleared, I've got no errors here. So I'm going to click IIS Express to run my application. So I'm going to show you exactly how these work as IIS catches up. So IIS is just starting my browser. Sometimes it does take a few seconds. You can see it's now brought me into the local server again. So it's give me localhost, and it's given me a port number here. What I'm now going to do is pop in my controller name. So in this case, the controller we've just created is called authentication. Okay, it does now load the authentication controller, but you can see that I'm getting some errors here. So it's asking to view, or it's asking for a file, which is a view called index.cshtml, and it's also asking for a shared index.cshtml. Okay, so that's something that we've actually missed when we've been setting up this controller. So I'm going to show you what we need to do next in order to get this to work. So I'm going to close this browser again, which will stop the server. I'm going to pop back into my application files on the right hand side here and look in the views folder. Now you can see inside this views folder I've got a home directory, and I've also got a shared directory. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new directory in here. Okay, so I'm going to go to add, new folder, and I'm going to match the name with the controller. So the new controller I've just created is called authentication controller. We already know it's a controller, so we're just going to use the name authentication. So I'm going to call this authentication. And I now have my new directory. Now inside this I'm going to add a view, but the easiest way to do this, and the way that I'm going to do this just for demonstration purposes, is I'm going to copy my index file from my home directory, and I'm going to paste it straight in to the authentication directory, like so. Now the important thing to recognise here is that we have an authentication folder which matches my new controller, and I also have an index which matches the function or the method name inside that controller. So I'm going to change some information on here. So I'm going to change this from home page to authentication so we can see this change in the browser. And I'm also going to say welcome to the authentication controller. And then we'll see how this looks in our browser. Okay, so I'm going to run that now. So again, Visual Studio is going to load up my browser. It's going to start up IIS in the background and it's going to show me what I have. So this just now that's displayed on the screen is actually the home controller, which is our default controller. I'm now going to add / authentication onto the end of that. And you can see I'm now viewing the authentication controller. Now, just to go through what a controller and a method is within a controller, what I can see is I've got localhost and a new port number in the address bar just now. What I'm going to do is add onto the end / authentication. And this is going to be our controller name. So this here in the address bar is the controller name that we've just set up. So remember, we did call it authentication controller. However, the start of it before where we say controller in the file name is what's relevant here. So it's / authentication. So this is our controller. Now onto the end of this, what I can do just to show you how methods work within a controller is I can add onto the end of that index, like so. You can see nothing really changes here. Now I'm going to go back to Visual Studio and just show you how this is working. Okay, so back into my authentication controller, I have my authentication controller here, which is our class. And then inside that I have a method, or what could also be known as a function, called index. So that is where we currently are looking in our browser. So again, we'll pop back to our browser, controller, method. Back to Visual Studio. In this controller, I also have a function or a method called login. So what I'm going to do is just prompt the browser now to show this method here. Now what we are going to get them to do this is an error, and the reason we're going to get an error is because I haven't created this view. So I'll just show you that. So I'm going to pass in login, and again we can see it has let me access this method, but it's given me an error, and the reason why is because I'm missing a view located in the authentication directory called login.cshtml. So I'm going to quickly go back and create that. I'm going to start by closing my browser. I'm going to go back into the views directory inside authentication, and I'm going to copy this file here. I'm going to paste it back in there. Paste it in there like so. And this needs to match the name of the method. So in this case it's login. Okay, now I'm going to open this file. I'm just going to tweak it so we can see that this is going to be our login screen. So I'm going to pop in there just the words login for the time being. Back to IIS Express. It's going to run the application for us. And then again I'm going to go back to my authentication controller. I'm then going to go through the different methods. So index, and then the one we were just checking, which is login. And you can now see, I can see the login screen. So that is, again, your controller and then your methods. So that's how controllers work for us. So there's nothing special about these, it's just displaying a data and a view onto the screen for us to see. There's no interaction yet with the database. There's no data sat in the background. So what we're looking at just now is our controller. So the controller's main purpose is to carry out any logic. So what I mean by logic is any specific program you want to carry out. So any ASP.NET Core code which is written in C#. Your controller should not be responsible for dealing with any data from your database. That's your model's job. The next thing we're going to do in this project is add a database to it. So the database is going to be using SQL Server. So you remember from the start of the tutorial we set up Visual Studio to work with SQL Server and also ASP.NET Core. So we have all the functionality built into this IDE, or this interactive development environment, ready for us to build directly with ASP.NET Core and SQL Server. So once we're back in to Visual Studio, what we'll need to do is just show the SQL Server Explorer. So I'm going to click on View. I'm going to look for SQL Server Object Explorer and just click that. Now that is going to bring up an additional sidebar, and on there we can see we have SQL Server just there. I am going to pin this to the left hand side so it's there and handy for me, so it's a good idea to do that so you can get back and forward to SQL Server when you need to. So now I've got this pinned to the left, I'm going to go back into it and I'm going to right click on SQL Server and I'm going to click Add SQL Server. Now there's a couple of different options here. Now because we're developing locally, we're going to go for local just now. I'm going to expand that and you can see I've got different options in there. Now I'm going to select MS SQL Local DB and you can see some of this information on here changes for me. And you can see I've got my machine name, I've got my username, we're going to use Windows authentication, and then I'm going to click connect. So I've not changed anything here, I'm happy with everything that's there, I'm going to click connect. Now on the left hand side you can see I've now got a new server showing, and this is just my local machine. So you can see there local DB, and I can expand this. In there I've got a folder called databases, which again I can expand. Now this is where we're going to add our database so that we can deal with some data within this application. So to do that I'm going to right click on the databases folder and I'm going to click add new database. Now I'm just going to call this store, which matches my application name. That doesn't particularly matter, you can call it whatever you want, but you need to remember the name because we're going to need to be able to connect to this. So once I've given a name, I'm going to click OK, and you can see my database pops into here. Now the first thing I'm going to do with this database is, because we're going to be dealing with some authentication, is I'm going to add in a users table. So I'm going to click this little arrow here again, and you can see it refreshes the database and then gives me a tables option. I'm going to expand tables, and you can see there's nothing in there at the moment. There's some additional folders, but there's no actual tables in that database, which is what we'd expect for a brand new database. I'm now going to right click on tables, and I'm going to select add new table. And you'll see in the background here that it's loading up a database design wizard for me, or database table design wizard. The design wizard in Visual Studio is quite clunky, so there's a few things we need to be aware of here. So the first is that we need to change the table name, and to do that we're actually going to do it directly in the code just here. So I'm going to call this table users. Your table name does need to have an uppercase letter at the start, otherwise it'll cause you problems later on down the line in your project. So that's an important side note at this stage, is to remember to give your table name a name with an uppercase letter at the beginning. So users in this case is what I'm going to call my table. Now at the top I've got an ID. I am going to rename that just to make it a bit clearer. Again, your field names should have uppercase letters at the beginning. So I'm going to call this user ID because that relates directly to my table name, which is users. I'm then going to give it a username, and I'm also going to add in a password. Now we're going to have a look at the data types that are available to us. So although this isn't a database design tutorial, we are going to have a quick peek at what we can do here. So we can select any SQL data types in here. So for the username, I'm going to have a nvarchar. Now I'm going to leave it at 50, that's plenty for a username. We could even reduce that really. Now the password, at the minute it's just got nchar and it's 10 characters long. I am going to change that, and I'm going to change it to text. The reason I'm changing it to text will become more apparent later on down the line when we start to add encryption and we start to hash our passwords. Okay, so now I'm happy with the fields that I've got in here for the basis of the start of our users table. I can now click update at the top here. Okay, and you'll see that the application starts to prepare our script. Now you can see there's nothing been highlighted. User actions are to create a new table called users. Okay, supporting actions aren't required. So I can generate a script and that will give me the SQL. I can also click update database, which is what I'm going to do just now. So I've updated the database. Down here you can see it running all the actions. So it's creating the table for us. Now one other important thing to note here is you can actually write SQL yourself. So if you want to write the table yourself, then these will just pop into the editor as you go. So if you're familiar with SQL, it is also good practice to get you used to using SQL. Now that I've finished with that table, I'm going to close the design view just by clicking this cross up here. I'm now going to look at my SQL Server Object Explorer on the left hand side, and you can see that my table's in here. Now I'm going to click on it once, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to click on View Data. And you can see I've now got a table view. I've got my user ID, my username and my password, but I have no data in here. Now one important thing that we've actually just missed when creating this table, so if we just close this, is we need to set up an identity. So what I mean by identity is a unique identifier, but we also need to allow it to increment automatically. So what I mean by that is when we add an additional user, the ID will start at 1, the next new user's ID will be 2, next new user's ID will be 3, and so on and so forth. So I'm now going to go back into this table, so this will get you used to actually editing tables as well anyway. I'm going to right click on it, I'm going to click on View Designer, which will get me back to this design view. You can see again that I've got my table code here in SQL, and I've also got my design view. Now we can already see that user ID is marked as a primary key based on this key icon just here. There is something else I need to do here to make sure that this has what's called an identity. So I'm going to click on here. I'm then going to go to the right hand side and look at my properties panel. I'm going to scroll down to the section where it says identity specification, so just here. I'm going to click the plus. I'm going to select true, it is identity, so that means that that is now a unique field. And I'm going to leave the increment at 1 and the seed at 1. So the increment just means how it's going to increment each time we add a new user, and the identity seed is just where we're starting from. So because we've got new users, the first user is going to start at the number 1. Once I've made those settings changes, click update at the top here, and I'm going to click update database, and you can see it's run that script, and you can see I've got a status update here to say the update's been run and it's been ticked as completed. I can now close this view again. And that is our database now effectively created. Although there's not a lot in there, there's not any tables set up other than our users table, the database is now ready for us to use. The only thing we need to do is tell our ASP.NET Core app that that database exists and that it can connect to it. So the next thing we need to do is go into the app settings.json file here. So you can see I've got that open just now. Underneath allowed hosts, I'm going to pop in a comma. And then on the next line, I'm going to add in some additional code. Okay, so that additional code looks like this. So we're going to add what's called a connection string. So we're going to say connection strings. And we're going to add a new connection string in here. So we're going to call it our default context. You can call this whatever you like. Our default context is just what we're going to call it because that's what the app is going to use to connect by default. So we're going to say default context, full colon, and then we're going to put in some speech marks. Now that's all we need to do at this stage, but we do now need to get some content to paste into here, and I'm going to show you where to get that from. Now the content we're pasting into here is actually called the connection string. So to get that, again we're going to go back to this tab on the left hand side called SQL Server Object Explorer. We're going to right click on our database name this time and click properties at the bottom. We'll then see this property tab load up at the bottom here if it's not already visible. Now if we scroll down, we're looking for the connection string setting, and we can double click in here and it'll highlight everything in there. We're going to copy that connection string. We're going to go back to our app settings.json file, and we're going to paste that straight into there. Now what we are going to do is just quickly check to make sure that the initial catalog setting in there is set to our database name, which in this case it is, so set as store. Sometimes that can be off, so just double check that. So it is called store, which means it's connecting to our store database. We can now just save that file. Okay, and that's our connection string set up. So that now means our ASP.NET Core application knows about the database that was created for it. At the moment, what we've got is we've got the basis of our ASP.NET Core application, we've got our database set up in SQL Server, and we've got our app which is now aware that the database exists using the connection string. We can now close our app settings.json file, and the next thing we're going to do is add in what's called a model. Now the model is what we'll use to communicate directly with the database, so it's going to carry out any of our commands, so such as adding users, deleting users, checking that a user exists. But first of all, what we need to do is create that model. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to right click on this models folder, we're going to add, and we're going to say new item. So what we're looking for in here is called a class. So we're just going to add that class by selecting class. We're going to change the name here, so we don't need to give it anything special in the name. So because we're dealing with the users, we're just going to make sure that it matches the table name in the database. So I'm going to call this users, and then going to click add. Now we can see that we get our new model here on the right hand side, and we also get our model file created for us. So again, we can see we've got our namespace, so it's the store app. We're using the models directory here. We've then got a public class called users. Now inside this, what we need to do is add in all of our fields in our table, and we're going to add them so that we can both get and set information where required. So I'm going to start by adding in the user ID. So public int user ID, and that's going to have a get method and a set method. After that, we're going to add in our username, which is going to be a string. So again, these field names all need to match in case, which is why I asked earlier that they had uppercase letters at the start. Again, that's going to have a get and a set method. And then I'm also going to add in our password, which at this stage is also going to be a string. And again, it's going to have get and set methods. Okay, and that's it. That's our model created. Now we can do additional things in here. What we've done is give the model standard functionality. So we're allowing it to both get information from the table and also set information in the table. So we've now got a standard model, which is going to work with our users table, which we created earlier. The next thing we need to do is add what's called a database context. Now the reason why we add a database context is because we're going to be using what's called the entity framework. So an instance of a database context basically represents a session with the database. So as we start to make use of our database and we start to make changes to both data in the table, updating, gathering, setting, deleting, any sort of act on that data that's in the database table, we'll start to see as we start to use entity framework why this is important to us. So the first thing we're going to do in order to set up this context is we're going to add a new folder to the root of application, which we're going to call data. So I'm going to right click on the project name itself. We're going to look to add a new folder and we're going to call it data. Now inside this file, what we're going to do is we're going to right click, we're going to add a new item, we're going to add a new class, and we're going to call it default context. Now the reason we're calling it default is just because it's going to be the context file that we use throughout the application at the moment. So we're going to add, and we end up with a blank class file again, and we can see at the top here that we have a public class called default context. So we are going to make some changes to this file. The first thing we're going to do is make sure that our default context is aware that we have models set up. So we're going to say using, we're going to use our application name, which is store in this case, and we're going to say models, like so. Okay, so now our context is aware that our models exist. Okay, so now we have our class set up. We've added in the ability for this to recognize that we have models there, and again we've now got our blank class set up. So we're going to make a few additional changes to here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change our namespace from store.data to store.models because we're going to be using the models for this. We're now going to add an additional base class onto the end of our class declaration here. So we're going to call it DB context. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add in some methods in here. So we're going to say public default context, DB context options. Inside some angle brackets, we're going to have default context. And then we're going to okay, so we now have the basis of our default context. What we are going to do is just tweak things ever so slightly in the end. We're going to add some additional information into here. So underneath, what we're going to say is public static object. We're going to call it store, which is our application name. We're going to say get, and then internal set, like so. Underneath this, we're now going to add in our actions for each of our tables in our database or each of our models. So we know at the moment we've just got a table called users, so we're going to add in an option to allow us to set some information in that table. So in here we're going to say public db set, and then in angled brackets we're going to say store.models.users, which is going to access our users model, followed by giving it a more practical name, which is just going to be users in this case. And we're going to say we're going to be able to get and set information against that table. So you'll see in this file at the minute we still have a few errors. The reason we've got these errors is because we're actually missing a package from Visual Studio at the minute. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a reference to our stores application. So we're going to right click on the application name at the top here. We're then going to go and look for manage NuGet packages. We're going to click on that. We're going to make sure we've got browse selected, and we're going to search for entity framework. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to click on this top option, and then we're going to click the little arrow pointing downwards, which is going to add it into our solution. So it's going to add it to our application. So we'll let Visual Studio do its thing. It should then add Microsoft Entity Framework Core into our application. So it's going to prompt us for some changes. We're going to click OK. We're going to accept them, and we're going to let it add them into our application. So now that that's done, you can see it's green and we've got it installed. We're going to close this. We're going to go back to our database context file, or default context file, and we're now going to add Microsoft Entity Framework Core, like so. And we can now see we've got all these errors gone. Now, like I said earlier on, we are going to be using Entity Framework throughout our application, and that will become the reason why we're going to use it will become more apparent as we get further into the development process. But that is us now set up in terms of our database, our models, and our default context, that our application can communicate effectively with the database. So I'm going to just save this file, so you can see usually when there's something that needs saved we have an asterisk on the end, so you can see that's appeared just now. If I just press Ctrl and S, that's gone, so that means that that file is now saved and safe for me to close. So I'm going to close that. Okay, and the next step is now for me to configure the application so that it knows that when I start it, it can connect to that database and it can deal with some data. In order to tell our application that our database context exists and that our database is there to connect to, we need to make some changes to what's called the startup file. So if I just scroll down in the Solution Explorer on the right hand side, I'm looking for the startup.cs file, and I'm going to edit that. Okay, now in this file we've got a section called Configure Services. Now inside this Configure Services section we're going to be adding in some additional code so that it knows to connect to our database. So we're going to drop it straight underneath what's already there, what's already existing. So I'm going to pop a new line in here. I'm going to say services, so which matches the line above, coincidentally on 25. .add db context. Okay, and then in my angled brackets, our database context name, which in this case is default context, followed by some brackets, which is where we're going to put in some options. So we're going to say options. We're then going to say options dot use SQL Server, which is going to tell our application to connect to the server. Use SQL Server, and then we're going to say to get configuration string from the configuration file which we set up earlier. So configuration.get connection string, and then we're going to use our default context, which is what we labelled it earlier again in that setup file, so in our app settings.json file. I'm then going to make sure I've got all my closing brackets, and then pop a semicolon on the end, and that's now our application being told to connect to the database. Now we can see on the left hand side that we've got an error here, so if I click this down arrow it's giving me some quick actions. So it's saying that we're missing a reference. Now this is good practice to get used to using this light bulb icon, because it will help you to fix some things that are going wrong. So what I am missing from here is my store models. So if I click on use and store models, we can see that repairs one of the errors for me. So we do have another area here, which you can see is highlighted by the squiggly line underneath Use SQL Server. So what that's telling me is that there's something missing again from our NuGet packages. So we're going to go back into our Solution Explorer, right to the top, right click on our application name, which is Store in this case. I'm going to go to Manage NuGet Packages, and I'm going to search for Entity Framework, just like before, but this time SQL Server, like so. And I'm going to click on this top package, which you can see is the Entity Framework Core SQL Server. I'm going to click this arrow to add it to our app. I'm going to let Visual Studio do its thing. It's going to ask me to confirm again, so I'm going to click OK. And then I accept. Okay, so that's it done its thing. You can see that's now green. So I'm going to close our NuGet. I'm just going to save this file, so startup.cs. And then it's giving me another suggestion here using this light bulb icon, which just means that I'm missing a user at the top of the file. So we can see right at the top of the screen here, I have some things that I've loaded in. So I'll just scroll to the left to show you these. So these are usings, which just means that we're adding something in for the application to use in this actual class. So this class being our startup file. So I can add that manually, or I can use the tools that Microsoft Visual Studio gives me. So I can click on this and say using Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and we can see that it's added this in for me, and you can see it's highlighted to say they've been added. If I now save this file, we can see that's now been done for us. Okay, so we've got that added in there. Now there are some additional things we can do here to tidy up this code. So at the minute I've got a big long statement with some options on a single line. So I'm going to use this light bulb here to help me with this, and I'm going to tell it to use a block body for lambda expressions, which means it's going to format my code. So you can see here just hovering on top of it, it's giving me a preview of what it's going to do to my code. So if I click on that, it's not done anything really to my code, it's just tidied it up and made it a bit clearer for me to read. So the same code's there, but it's now on multiple lines and formatted correctly and indented properly. I can now save that file, and I'm done with my startup.cs file for now. So that's it for this tutorial. What we've done today is we've went through setting up an ASP.NET Core web application. We've created an SQL database, and we've let our application know that a database exists and how to connect to it. We've also looked at creating both views, models, and also controllers. In the next tutorial, we'll look at actually making this login system work. So we'll go through creating users, we'll also go through removing users, and also checking that that user exists and that their credentials are correct before allowing them into a specific part of your application. Keep checking back for new videos and join us again next week, where we'll continue on with this tutorial series.